Hi, welcome to NorthumbriaCommunity.com. We're standing here on Holy Island, and I think probably it was about 30 years we've got a photograph of me, Linda and Andy standing by on St Cuthbert's Island. But the tide's in, so we can't be there today. We just want to welcome you to our site because we want to tell the story of the foundation of the Northumbria community. What most people don't realise, I think, is that we had about 14 years of pioneering, and during those 40 years there's all kinds of people and places that are important to us, and on this site we want to tell you about some of them people, tell you about some of them places, but most of all we want to tell you the nitty-gritty story of how God led us and built us up. In particular, we want to talk about some of the main foundation stones. That's the office book, the rule, and also the development of new monasticism. If you're part of the community, then this is your history. If you're curious about new monasticism, this is a good place to be. And if you just want to hear a story of God's love amongst broken people, then this is a great site. So this is what this site's about. It's not just about the past, it's about building on the past the future, and that's what we hope will encourage many, many others to do. So Linda, over to you, and let's see what you've got to say for yourself.
Oh gosh, well I think community is about living on the edge, because when you've got 4 kids, all under about 10, and you've got John to live with and Andy to live with, things can get pretty scary and pretty hairy. And loads of visitors, people you don't know, doors constantly knocking, the phone could be ringing, people asking to stay, and really that they are very testing times about what's on the inside. And it's about being open to one another when the pain levels can get a bit high, and it's about saying sorry to one another, and it's also being open to God. But to be honest, they are the most exciting times and the most dangerous times in God.
Standing here, I keep thinking in terms of what we were able to build back then was then building new things on foundations that were already old. Because, say, standing here where Aidan came with his companions, we were very aware that there was something still that was active that had been begun long ago. And I would say that the stories of the community and its beginnings are still significant now, not just in the echoes that you find in the office and in the stories that are told and in people's living memories. But something was begun in the spirit that is still continuing to resonate. You never know when you're throwing a rock or a pebble into the water, which of those are going to be the things that will continue to have impact, or will impact a person far away in either time or in geographical distance. But we knew that the stuff that we were carrying was important, and we tried to carry it with all of our heart. I don't know quite what the future is going to have or hold for any of us, but I do know that our stories are still linked for the future as well as for the past, and that we need to find our right seats and find the right place in God's destiny, and I pray that you all will be able to do the same.
Hi, welcome back to NorthumbriaCommunity.com. I'm here this afternoon with Andy on Holy Island, and we want to talk about 2 things. First is the genesis of the Northumbrian office, and the second thing is the genesis of the Northumbria rule. So I'm going to ask Andy to kick off and just give us a broad picture of how the Northumbrian office developed in book form.
My first recollection would be that we had this particular book years ago when I was working at Marygate House, and Roland Walls from the Community of Transfiguration at Roslin used to try and look after us and keep us in line. At one stage he set us a number of passages that we were to read regularly and pray, and so we wrote them out in a book, and some of those will be quite familiar to people. There's Psalm 27,
That's Roland's big deal, wasn't it?
Colossians 3, there's Matthew 12, there's the Charles de Foucault prayer of abandonment. And then what happened was that whenever there was significant things after that for us on the island, I ended up writing them in to this same book. So that began to develop, so that when we finally were putting together, say, the meditations for the office book, this was already the resource book that we came back to. We used to laughingly call this book The Office. One Easter workshop, as we were going to be at Grange Road at Jarrow, John said, I think it's time we put together an office, morning, midday, evening prayer, and that we could test drive over the Easter workshop.
When was it?
1986, did we just say?
I can't remember.
Let me just check. 1992 it was. So that was as we were approaching Easter of 1992. John said that, and I know we sat down and in one evening we put together that morning, midday and evening prayer, and we did it including writing the song for the one thing I have asked of the Lord.
I remember that, yeah.
It included us deciding that we wanted to keep the these and thous for the Lord's Prayer, and then all the other things that fell together for the midday prayer were able to be done with the these and thous as well, because a couple of the let nothing disturb thee and the teach us, dear Lord, had the these and thous in it, and we didn't want to lose the music. Okay.
Yeah, Andy mentions Roland Wars, who was a great friend and supporter of ours, Brother Roland. And when we were thinking about putting together the office book, well, I always used to go up and ask Roland for advice. And he gave us some pretty good advice, and this is it. Make sure the prayers are part of your story. That was number one. Keep it Trinitarian and theologically substantial. That was number two. And perhaps the best bit of advice for Andy was keep it short and keep it simple. So that's the three bits of advice that Roland gave us, and those thoughts were in the back of my mind when we were starting to gather stuff and put it together. And I think the first thing is, make sure the prayers are part of your story. We really were going through prayers probably over a 14-year period, because Andy talks about the book from Holy Island, but we also had the prayers that we were collecting during our time of learning to live in community together, just a small group of us, and also through the Easter workshops. You agree with that, Andy?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think it starts with that putting together that morning, midday and evening prayer as an example of something that we could test drive over the few days that we were together.
Yeah.
And we weren't really expecting the kind of response that we got, which was from our own folk, and they just sort of said, when we asked them what did they make of the morning, midday and evening prayer, they said, when can we have it and be allowed to take it away so we can use it all the time? And I think we thought that everything we were doing was provisional or an example of something that could happen. And to our surprise, it's not grown stale. You know, all these years later, it still feels as alive and as provocative as it did then.
I think the important thing all the time for us, we were writing stuff for ourselves.
Yes.
We weren't writing for a market or thinking we were going to be, it was actually going to go anywhere. We were saying, we need to do this.
But you were, even then though, John, you were saying it's important that we do something that is specifically Trinitarian. You were saying those things, and you may well have been thinking in terms of what Roland had said to you, but I remember you saying that at this particular juncture it's important that what we're saying is spiritual but not vague, that it is actually rooted.
Yeah. Just some fundamental things about the office. We call it the Northumbrian office because it actually evolved in Northumbria, and it's got a distinctly Celtic feel to it, not because we thought let's write something Celtic. It's because we live in Northumbria, and Northumbria is Celtic. And we live in a context of the Northumbrian saints. And that environment is part of us. It's what we live, it's what we breathe. So there wasn't any, let's style this Celtic. It just came out with a Celtic flavour because that's our environment that we live in. We live in the Isle of the Saints, don't we?
Well, I mean, that's been our story. I know for me, my story was a call to Holy Island, and I was trying to find out what was distinctive about Holy Island, what made it special. And I think other people who were called back to this area around the island, around the area of the Nether Springs as well, we were still trying to find out what was there rooted in the physical history and that was tangible. And it did go back to those Celtic roots.
I think the other thing that is important on this theme of make sure the prayers are part of your story, you know, there seems to be a tendency nowadays that people just sit down and write an office book. And our office book came out of our life together, and it's the memory stones of 14 years. It wasn't, we didn't just sit down and say, these are canny prayers, let's put these in. We looked at prayers that were actually had significant meaning for us throughout our journey. And when you look in the office book, you can hear voices, can't you? You can hear voices, you can tell stories of the people who contributed because they were part of what we were about and what we were doing.
Those people as well were a dispersed people. There was this mixture of people who were local and dropped in, and the people who came from further afield. There was always that mixture, so that Easter workshops became a stimulus for all kinds of creativity, but also a sharing of vision. And there was a kind of vulnerability and brokenness as a common denominator right from the beginning too.
You're talking about people who weren't here with us and coming from a distance. I think about Peter. May the peace of the Lord.
Oh, well, Peter wasn't even specifically with us in terms of community.
No.
He was somebody who crossed paths with both of us, you know, from his beginnings here on the island in Aidensweek, in, I would say that would be 76, and then was at college with you as well. But that song, that prayer has been something that has meant a lot to loads of people. That may the peace of the Lord Christ go with you.
I still use it, and you use it many times. One of the things I think it's important to say is that the Northumbrian office had a theme to it. And that theme was pretty much what we were experiencing in our everyday lives. And it was a question from God. I call it a transpersonal question, an existential question, that we were all picking up, which basically God was saying to us, what do you want? Who are you seeking? And the first prayer is deliberate. It was based on the Jewish Shema. Shema, thank you. And he'll always keep us right. And it begins with, who are you seeking? What is it that you're looking for? And our reply is, we're seeking God. We're seeking Him with all our heart, with all our mind, with all our soul, with all our strength. And we were experiencing that, weren't we, in Northumbria, that we were having good, solid Christian people come to visit us, but they felt there was something more. And that something more wasn't a criticism of where they'd been. It was almost a hunger in them to express, to learn, to get down to the basics of knowing God, not just in an individual sense, but also in a community sense. So there's a theme in the Northumbria office, and that theme really is, who is it that you seek? Or as I like to put it, when the Lord says, what is it you're looking for?
John, you were saying, who is it that you seek is like saying, what do you want? It is in the sense that when you come to God and you ask for something, if you don't ask, you don't get it. That bit's true. But the who is it that you seek is more than that as well, because it's also about seeking the face of God, and that in some ways is persevering through the things that stop us seeing God, and also that God Himself seems to hide so that we find Him in a new way. While I'm on, one of the things that people would say to folk who are beginning to get somewhere in the prayer, they would say, well, if you're not as close to God as you used to be, who moved? And that's the most unhelpful thing, because it implies that we are the one that moved, that somehow we've slidden away from God, that we've volitionally turned our back on Him because it's harder to get through than it was before somehow. And that's often just not the case.
Yeah. I'm with you on that, and I think one of the things that really helped me was the whole Merton thing about darkness.
Right.
And basically Thomas Merton says that there's two types of darkness that come into the life of a believer. And the first, because of our sin. We do something that basically is against God's heart, against the heart perhaps of somebody we love, and in order to get out of that darkness we've got to ask forgiveness, either of God or both, or our brother or sister. But the other type of darkness, and the darkness that we started to get familiar with, is when God removes Himself, and there's no reason. He just removes Himself, and He does it because he's wanting us to move higher, to get a bigger picture of him, who he is, and to let go perhaps of some of the wrong ideas that we have of him. And I think one of the things we discovered, didn't we, in Northumbria in our early days, we had good, solid Christian people who were coming to us and saying, there's something going on here and I don't know what it is. There's something changing. There's something, God doesn't seem the same, or God seems to be absent. And I think one of the things that I realised, that it wasn't just happening to individuals. It was happening to us as communities of people, in our church communities, in our communities as a whole. And then we began to seek God together. And I think that's reflected in the office book that we put together. There's that seeking after God, because we're looking, it's not even looking for a bigger picture, it's because we can't do anything else. There's almost an angst to it, that we have to do it, and we're going to do it, whether anybody else is doing it or not. I think that's fair to say.
And I think part of the word office meaning work, is sometimes it is hard work, and you're persevering with a rhythm of seeking God, even when it seems that there's no point. And that, as you would say, that God is meanwhile weaning us off a dependence on the sensation of his presence,
yeah,
or what it is that he's saying, to a point where we're seeking him for his own sake.
Yeah, let's move on and
back to the office.
Back to the office. Rollins, keep it Trinitarian and theologically substantial.
So you were, when we came to the midday office, you were throwing in, we believe and trust in God the Father Almighty, we believe and trust in Jesus Christ his Son. Or this, if you didn't throw that in, you were saying we needed a Trinitarian one at that point. And it was you that put in the structure of, we'll have a canticle, we'll have a creed in each of the three of one sort or another, a creedal statement, and we'll have a blessing at the end. You pulled that structure together, and with the morning and the evening we would throw in the scripture readings and the dwelling on that, some kind of commentary and the meditations. But for the midday one, we wanted to be something working a bit like the way the Angelus did, where you're in the middle of working and the bell rings and you stop, you take a few moments and you continue. And that stop needed to be short enough that it wouldn't impinge upon the working day, but rather would bring a focus to it. And we were delighted to find that the things that we naturally would have put into the midday one also turned out to be the ones that would tally with the these and thous, if you will. Yeah. So I remember the whole process of that so clearly.
Yeah. And I think since I've lived in Turkey, I've appreciated the theologically substantial bit of the office, in terms of we've got no recognisable Christian symbols anywhere. And so we live in a society that's 99 I think it's 8% Muslim, my Muslim neighbours, and quite rightly they have their way of worship, they have their way of understanding God. But for those of us who live in that environment, the office becomes what I've always felt it to be, not a rote of prayer, but something that enables you psychologically, spiritually, to remain on course. And it's the little boat in the big sea.
It seems to me that it's something that is almost what they would call self-activating prayer, that you develop a rhythm of prayer that becomes such a natural part of you that it almost is going to pray itself. And that would be very much in the Eastern tradition. The other thing I remember was that we chose to put the Christ as a Light, the John Michael Tower version of the Patrick prayer, in the morning office because of this tradition in the Celtic peoples that would be an example of the prayer that you would say as you put your clothes on a morning. So it was equipping you to face the day.
Yeah, I've got a couple of stories here on the computer. When I was a young priest, I remember going to see an old lady. She was a regular churchgoer, and she'd had a stroke, and since she'd had a stroke she never spoke, and she'd never spoken at all, and I had to go and give her the sick communion.
And I went and sat down with her, not really expecting a lot, to be honest, and I opened up the liturgy and started saying the liturgy, and she joined in. And she joined in all the way through, all the prayers, and then finished. And then she never spoke again until she died. And that's a classic example of me of the value of liturgy, that it's in our darkest days. It's in the moments where we can't act for ourselves, that we've got this word that's washed into our very being, and that upholds us and sustains us. And that was one of the first times I really thought, God, liturgy is just so right.
I think one of the other things for me is that extemporary prayer is okay, but it's actually quite hard work, because that kind of spontaneity is very hard to sustain.
Yes, especially if you're a minister.
And it can become desperately wordy if you're not careful, or can lose its drift. Whereas if you really know the things that you want to pray, and somebody's already put them in words that say it for you, it's so much more focused. And the clarity of some of these Celtic style prayers, or other things that just moved in sync with them, because we weren't bound to everything having to be Celtic, far from it. But just things that have got some substance to them, but aren't overly convoluted. I remember we did the Teach Us Dear Lord, which is Psalm 90, but I remember the very first time I heard that, and I was in YWAM in Canada, and hearing those words sung, one, it was so beautiful, and two, just that I felt like I wanted to adopt that prayer for the whole of my life. And that was one of the ones that I brought to the office when we were preparing it, because it was so precious to me. And another one was the I Trust in Thee, O Lord. I remember
that's one of my
1978.
Yeah. I remember Anna singing that.
Yeah. I remember Anna singing it as well. But I remember Marcia actually teaching it to us as part of one of our classes in Canada, and it's written there amongst my notes. I know the exact moment when it came to me. My times are in Thy hands, and at the time I was, as it were, in exile from Holy Island. I was waiting to go back and just trusting that Roland Walls knew what he was doing.
Yeah, but the good thing about it as well, I can identify totally with that prayer as well, and I think that's, if you've got prayers that are substantial, then they resonate with other people, don't they? And we'll just get into it. Final bit from Roland: keep it short and simple. Now, as I remember, when we tried to put our office together, I remember the morning office, I think you had 28 pages.
No.
Did you not? You had an awful lot.
No. I think what you're thinking of, when we were doing the complins, our first complins, we had
that's the Aiden one.
We had an Aiden and a pulpit, and they both were quite long, and they still are compared to the other complins. And if you had them handwritten and stuck together on bits of paper, they went over several pages.
But we got there, and
yes.
I mean, your intention, I know, because it's what you like.
Not to miss anything.
Not to miss anything. I've just been out in Andy's shed yesterday, and I mean, sitting in his living room now is such a picture of the past, because I said we used to sit at home when we've lived together at different points, and gradually the floor would disappear. Andy would be sitting on the floor surrounded by papers. I'd be on a chair, and eventually the floor would just disappear, and pages would appear. And what we had to do when we do the office, we had to decide what was important. Was it going to flow in the rhythm of the office as well? Because that was important. And I mean, I think our main desire was people could do this on the move. You know, people could... I've said here, or I've written that, you could do this in a small group, a large group, over a cup of coffee. You could do it on the bus, on the train, where you were travelling.
People have done all of those things.
Yeah. And also I've got somebody up a mountainside in Tibet, as one group did.
And midday office would be said in the time it takes to boil a kettle, or you could say it several times in the time it takes to boil a kettle in the States, because they're on a different wattage. But or you could do it the time it takes to go to the toilet if you're at work, come back again. You know, it's just that kind of in the middle of everyday life. And some of the things that we didn't include as meditations, John, ended up...
Other places.
Yeah, they came in as daily readings and so on. particularly in some of those first ones.
Yeah. Now, what I'm aware of, we should have done this at the beginning, but we didn't, because we always jump to the conclusion that when you talk about a daily office, everybody knows what you're talking about. Now, when we first started off, a lot of the people that we were involved with didn't know what we were talking about. So let's just put a couple of bits in. A daily office simply is a fixed set of prayers, readings and songs that are used or said or sung every day. Sometimes, depending on the tradition, we might do it on a Sunday. Now, what we agreed to do, I don't know whether you still do this in the Northumbria community, was not to have an office on a Sunday and not to have a Eucharist, so that people could go out to church. And that was an emphasis that we had back then.
I think even then, what we did was we said we wouldn't have a Sunday Eucharist, because what we didn't want was people vacating the churches in order to come to us.
That's exactly right.
Whether anybody ever went to church was a totally different issue. And then I think the other thing was, on the island, we used to do office publicly, and we did it every day but Sunday. Yeah. Now, say at Hetton, they've always done office for years, right the way through. The only time you might not get it might be, say, on a Thursday night, if there were people who had been staying for the week had gone, and the ones who had come for the weekend hadn't arrived.
Okay.
There might not be a night compline or something.
Yeah. Also, most offices, daily offices, are made up of morning and evening prayer, and hopefully as well midday prayer. Also, some monastic communities have the 7 prayers, which will go on through the night. We didn't think that was a good idea when we're trying to bring up our families as well. Now, usually an office, sorry, I'll just get this bit now. Usually an office consists of prayers and meditations, readings from the Psalms and Scripture, very important, and canticles and songs. Sorry, you want to add?
All I was going to say is, as well, I don't want anybody getting the impression that most people, say from the community, would ever keep up a rhythm of doing morning prayer, midday prayer, evening prayer, compline every day.
Yeah.
There would be some people, perhaps somebody who was retired or someone who was out of work or whatever, who might decide that it was going to be their priority to keep up each of those offices. But for most folk, they would fall into a rhythm or a pattern of what worked with their circumstances. So for us, for many years, what we did was we would do morning office publicly down at the little Catholic church here on the island. We did that for maybe 15 years, something like that. But for a long time, we kept that going every day but Sunday, and somebody would be there. And then we would do compline with the kids as we put them to bed. So they grew up always knowing that. But we didn't try and do more than that. We'd do a midday prayer if we remembered, or perhaps during Lent or something.
It's interesting because Linda's always kept the office alive for us as a family. And we'll see it come hell or high water ourselves. Right. And we fit ourselves in around that, depending where we are, what we're doing, in the community, where we're working or whatever. But I must say in recent days, especially because we live in a different environment, that the office has become a more regular thing.
More irregular or
more regular.
More regular.
Yeah, and I think because we need it.
I think it's different patterns for different seasons, and also very much it's better for somebody to aim less high and actually achieve what they aim for than to become discouraged by trying to do too much too quickly.
Now, not everybody in the free church, independent churches have been keen on liturgy. And really, there's been a resurgence over the last 10, 20 years. But one of the interesting things I found out about the office recently was that its roots go right back into Judaism and right back to the era of the Babylonian exile. And I thought that was fantastic because the Jews had to leave their country. They left unexpectedly. They left unintentionally. They didn't want to leave at all. And they were taken into exile, and it said they developed then a rhythm of prayer. And they developed it in order that they wouldn't lose their own identity, and it would keep them connected into God. And that's very much what the office is for me. It is something that keeps you rooted and connected into your Christian faith, your Christian background, your Christian history. So for the traditional monastic community, the office has been at the heart of monastic life. And I think for the new monastic communities too, the value of the office is beginning to be more and more appreciated. So I'm glad, Andy, we've been able to offer a small contribution. We didn't expect it to go so well, did we really? Or we didn't know, did we?
Well, I've always had the feeling, I think we were surprised when everybody said, let's just keep it as it is. And that all these years later that we would still be using so much of it exactly the same. But and like when we first did the office book and printed it for ourselves, you know, we'd got one bequest, but it wasn't enough to buy a house with. And we got the chance of, I think it was 500 of these filofaxes. We used a filofax or daytime of the American.
Yeah, just show everybody that one.
And,
the first one.
But it's loose leaf thing with where you can
Because
take
it was
things
still
in and out.
experimental, wasn't
The
it?
idea was that whatever went in, we might want to change it, and then it became useful because you would put in a month of daily readings at a time and then change them. But we very much thought that anything we were doing was provisional. We didn't think that it would turn out to be as I was going to say successful. That's the wrong word. As enduring as it was.
Well, you did all the negotiations with HarperCollins when they come, because I wasn't fussed about having anything to do with HarperCollins at the time.
A lot of the problem was acknowledgements and copyrights and all that sort of thing. But and sometimes I think we've ended up acknowledging too little. But when we do as much as anthologising as what I do, when we're putting together the daily notes and things, your acknowledgements are almost as long as the text.
Andy, just run through the development of the office there with us before
with
we
the
close
books.
up. Yeah, just with the books.
So that was our first one.
That's
we
the
did
first.
500 and flogged off the excess at some conferences.
That's it.
One of them must have fallen in the hands of HarperCollins, and they wanted us to do the Northumbrian office but call it Celtic Daily Prayer. So we consciously picked out... Yeah, that was right, but I consciously picked out readings that did more to do with the Celtic stuff out of what we'd done. The night prayer was the supplements to it. It was other stuff that by now other people had in their filofaxes as an additional pack, and another 12 months of notes. Then it became the Celtic Daily Prayer, which had the two books previously slightly revised, put in there, and then a lot of other resources. We did a third one, Celtic Daily Readings, which was a third year of notes, just as a supplement, which they brought out quite quickly, went out of print. And then you've got other editions. That's the American one, which doesn't fall apart as quickly, and that's a subsequent British edition. So they might look a bit different, but they're the same animal.
Yeah. Now I live in Turkey now, and I'm going in a little bit of a new direction. So I've actually revised my office. So the office that I originally did with Andy, the Northumbrian office, is still in our office book, but we've developed another one now called Emigre, a daily office, simply because we're in a completely different environment, a completely different place, and the prayers that we now read are more conclusive to what we're doing. But my heart is rooted in my history, and my history is in the Northumbrian office with you. The point being, this rule it's been rooted in our history, but also a history that's way bigger and far deeper than we have ever experienced in our tradition, the Northumbrian church, the Irish church, and that's reflected, I think, in some of the things that have helped us and helped create this rule. Now, we want to move on now, and I just want to do some of the practicalities, Andy, of what we actually said. There's two parts of the Northumbria community rule, availability and vulnerability. And again, they come out of our experience. In order to live this life, we found we had to be available. And in our case, what that availability meant was we had to lay down certain things that perhaps we might like to do personally in order to make ourselves more available to God. And availability also meant for me that I had a family to feed, so I needed to work, I needed to do things. You had yourself to support and your ministry to support because you were travelling everywhere. And so availability to us meant that we had to have an intentional way of living. and we chose an intentional way of living. And in that availability, we learned first that we needed to be available to God in the cell of our own heart. And what we mean by that is, within the monastic tradition, there's a picture of the cell being the place where you really face up to who you are, who God is. It's not a place for running away, I can guarantee that. And it's the place where basically, Andy's got a part of the picture rule here.
I've got two pictures which I was looking for.
Yeah,
the first one here.
Can you get this on up?
It says, seek God for yourself, don't get others to do it for you. And there's a picture here of a cell, and the person in there is thinking, go to your cell and your cell will teach you everything.
That's a great desert father.
And this one, the heading is, in the desert, and here you've got a nice distant desert landscape, and there's a little voice bubble, and it says, dear God, wish you were here.
Yeah, one of the big things about the cell, I used to have a saying called Alone Together, and what was at the heart of that was that you were called first by God by yourself. So it's the old thing of Jesus looking at his disciples and calling them, and they had to make their own response. And that was something they did alone. And then when they made that response, they found themselves in community with other people who had made that response. And therefore they weren't responsible for entertaining that other group of people. They weren't responsible for making that other group of people happy or making them feel good about themselves. They were responsible for responding with those companions on their journey to Jesus.
It was God who had called those other people to be there, so therefore it was God who was responsible for them, not the other folk who...
Yes. Yeah. And so, in our earliest community days, we never saw ourselves as counsellors. We were too broken to be counsellors anyway. We saw ourselves as companions. I never saw myself as a counsellor.
I think we did an enormous amount of counselling.
We did.
People.
But I never saw
we always counselled people with what was the best that we knew at the time, and just hope. But certainly, you're back to your wounded healers thing.
Yeah, it is a wounded healer thing. I saw myself as a companion with other people, and if there was people who were struggling with stuff and I had something to pass on with them, I'd pass it on. But I very quickly wanted them to see themselves as people and not as casualties or victims or less people than we were. And I think that was hence the cell, hence the whole thing of you have a responsibility here yourself to seek God for yourself, to really face yourself. And that was a continual emphasis. And I think the alone together thing was a great help in bringing us together as community as we began to grow, because there wasn't that sense of the leaders have got to do something.
That alone together, we used to have a picture, I've got it just over there, I think, of the individual cells where you'd have two uprights and a slopey roof, you know. And we would have one on its own, and then you would have a clump of them. And a clump of those cells didn't mean that everybody was living in the same cell, but that there were people who were aware of each other being there, all on the same journey of seeking God. But they still
and all over the place.
And further far.
Yeah, I think it's important to get that in right at the beginning. We're a community that's dispersed. We had a mother house that I was there for a long time. Andy's on Holy Island. We had people that lived at the mother house simply because they were helping to administer everything that was growing and developing, but the community was dispersed. And there's certain things that held us together. And
the temptation was always to get engrossed in the difficulty about working what the mother house was about, and there was always the temptation to become preoccupied with that and see that as being what the community was, whereas the community was always the dispersed people, not that.
But I think that's grown, hasn't it?
Oh, very much.
I think as we balanced out the Nether Springs, Upper Springs visions as well, that's grown. Another aspect of our lives, which I found out later was a major aspect of monastic communities, was hospitality. And hospitality was almost forced upon us in many ways, simply because people would pop in, wouldn't they? I mean, I don't know where people came from half the time. I think you brought a lot of people home. I remember coming back to Ravensdown one day. I'd been down to see my mum with Linda, and I came back in, and the house was full. And I remember the guy sitting on the settee, he said, "Who are you?" And I said, well, I live here. And those were your visitors.
I can't remember who that would have been.
Can you not remember?
Could have been anybody.
I couldn't remember who that was. But hospitality became a big deal thing, didn't it? And we
And
talked.
the house was big enough.
Yes.
Actually,
Yeah.
and I think this made a big difference. It might not have been sort of, expensively furnished or anything like that, but it was a big enough property that if you needed to get away from the people, there were physically places to go, and I think that does make a big difference.
It makes an enormous difference. We've just done a thing with 4 kids going through community, and our place is big enough in Turkey, and they said one of the most important things was having somewhere to go yourself,
Yes.
where you've got space to be. But coming back to this theme of hospitality, hospitality can be extremely dangerous for families, and I think throughout our experience from living first at Ravensdown, where we had a big enough place, then to the Grange, where we had you living in the cupboard and people coming, and then to Hetton Hall, where we were actually living in the house before our place is worked out, and our kids are living with everybody. We have to put boundaries in. And it's important that for any community to know their limits and to know their boundaries, and for any family to know their
I'm
boundaries.
going to show you another picture again.
An exercising community.
This one's, we've nicked a picture from a cartoon, Life of St John of God, never mind.
That's
Who
it, it's holy ground.
It says, family life is holy ground, and it's got a cartoon here of a family, but then on the wall is pinned a little thing which says tread gently.
Yeah.
And I think, I haven't realised just how much, whenever I think of the words out of any part of the office, I'm automatically seeing the pictures.
Mm.
The pictures have been what have fixed things in our heads, I think.
But I think as well, one of the reasons you did that was because when we started off, a lot of the people that we were living with couldn't read.
Or were not comfortable reading.
Yeah.
Certainly a lot of words together would have been too much.
The community rule. Where did the community rule come from? How did it come together? How did it develop? And I think what most people don't realise is it developed over quite a long period of time. I mean, we didn't ask to be in community together. We were called to community, both Linda, Andy and I, and ended up living together pretty early on. That was back in '78 in Berwick. And learned some lessons then. Some hard lessons, I think, as well. I mean, especially I would say, Andy, around hospitality, because sometimes I didn't know if I was coming or going. There was that many people coming into the house. You have to remember, Linda at this time as well, and I had a new baby. So we were working things out in a very real context, in a very real way. And then I think we lived together again in Aycliffe.
We did.
I was a new curate. We had another baby by then, I think. And did you have a bedroom then, or were you?
Well, we lived together in Aycliffe initially in Shafto Way,
Yeah, that's right.
and then we moved up to the Ballarat.
That's
I've got a little fragment out stuck up in my shed there of the material and the wallpaper and everything that we
That's
had
it.
for my room in the Ballarat.
That's
So there
right.
you go.
And then, was it the Grange?
Then at the Grange.
Yeah, the Grange is the first Nether Springs, and this is in North Northumberland. I mean, the way we got to the Grange is amazing, but I'm not, that's a different story. But Andy actually lived in a cupboard in my kids, 2 of my girls' bedrooms, and he was the talk of the school because the kids used to say, "Who's the man that lives in your cupboard?"
We've only just found this out in the last...
You know, I'd known about it. The kids had mentioned it before. Now, I seriously mean a cupboard. There was no room to stretch out. I made you a bed. Was it me who made you the bed? Or
Can't remember.
might have been Chris. It would probably be Chris because you would have went on your back. But we had this bed and it was only about 4 foot.
It was like it was a cabin.
It was a cabin.
Yeah.
I never know how it was fine because you're about 6'3", aren't you?
Yeah, well, I sleep curled up.
It seems curled up. So Andy had this cupboard with this bed with books.
All around.
Because
And a light.
I used to go to Nick
And a light, yeah.
And a light.
But that was just literally a place to sleep.
It was a place to sleep.
It was a big enough
The
house.
point
It just
being,
wasn't a spare room.
The point being, these are real situations, and the way for living that we gave voice to, that we gave words to, was actually forged out of our real life situations as we were discovering what it meant to live together in community. I was working out new monasticism in the middle of this.
And cleaning windows.
Cleaning windows and doing gardens and having 4 kids. And you are looking who you were going to have 4 kids with. And it was all the down-to-earth, nitty-gritty stuff that makes a life. And that's just so important, because we've got no chance this afternoon of Andy brought out a bag before. It's over there actually.
Well, the file I've got.
It's about this thick, and basically it's notes, stories. Here it is. You see,
That's my notes on chapters to do with the bits in the rule at
Yeah.
the moment. Some of them are written.
now most of these are living experiences, or the stories that gave us coherence when we were trying to find out how we were going to live. Andy said something funny the other day. I think it was today. He was saying about the daily office, and people think there's some magical reason why it was at 9:30. Well, actually, we made it for 9:30 because we had the school runs to do before, and so our lives were, our rhythm of life, our way for living, was forged out of living every day. And for most of the time, that meant you were travelling all over the place.
Hitchhiking horse.
Hitchhiking.
Yeah.
I mean, he still hasn't got a decent suitcase. I thought he'd have a decent suitcase by now.
Wow.
He thinks he's got one. He's just had bags that he brought out before with no handles on. But my enduring pictures of Andy are on the A1 or the A167 with his thumb out with all these bags. Most of the content which I knew because he packed them on the living room floor at the house. And in the meantime, I'm digging gardens with Chris, dear Chris and Sandra.
They're picking eggs.
They're picking eggs. We did that many jobs, Chris and I. Painting and decorating. Window cleaning was the best because I was terrified of heights and used to keep falling off. And then also we just had people. So in the middle of it we had people. We had very little cash between us. You had your Special America fund I used to hate, because I'd be starving most of the time, and you'd have your Special America fund to take you to America, which was quite right. But it's in that context that this rule was forged, isn't it? Is that?
Well, that and all the other ones that accumulate.
Yeah.
By the time we came to do a rule,
Yeah.
what we were doing was, if you think of the question where they said, somebody says to Jesus, "Where do you live?" and he says, "Come and see."
Yeah.
And that had been always the way that we'd worked, although it was in a sort of dispersed setting, people would come and see. Now, there was a point at which interest in the community and what we were about had taken on such a momentum that we couldn't say to everybody, "Come and see." There just wasn't, and we needed to start formulating things that people could go away and look at and hold against their lives. And what we were trying to do was articulate something that was an expression of the values that we collectively had been living in our various circumstances over a number of years. Yeah. And I remember sitting down and going through that together. We knew the task, we knew why we were doing it, but we were trying to do something that would be inspirational and not prescriptive. And we wanted something which was not too bogged down with this is the way you do this and that's the way you do the other, but rather was something that was going to fire people's hearts and change their way of living.
Yeah. I think it's important. This is called the Northumbria Community Rule, and the context in which we lived was Northumbria. And when we talk about Northumbria, we're thinking the ancient kingdom of Northumbria, because Aycliffe for me was Northumbria too, in terms of my understanding, because there was lots of stuff that developed.
But a
there.
lot of the people, even at the time that we were doing it,
Yeah.
were people who were living well outside of Northumbria, never mind Northumberland. And they were also looking back to a place and a time in history where the Northumbrian church was birthed, and where the kind of spirituality and mechanisms and values that were still informing us now were being worked out in practice, and places like the island and the actual geographical area meant a lot to other people,
Yes.
even although they didn't live
They
here.
didn't live here.
So, but it was never exclusively for the people who were
No.
around here.
No, but the link was important. And, I mean, I never think in linear terms. I think in terms of when I'm here, I'm back with the saints. You know what I mean? We've got specific saints here who are we're part of their community in some way. Aidan, Cuthbert, there's all kinds of people who are as alive in my heart. I'm just beginning to experience this in Turkey now because I've got the beloved John.
Yes.
I've got Mother Mary. I haven't made the same links yet. And I'm not talking in any weird way now. I'm talking practically that these are members of my family. They're part of our...
When we talk about Aidan or Oswald or whoever it is, these are people who we know and we know well.
Yes.
And we know exactly how they feel about things. We know enough stories about them, and those stories are very vivid to us.
Yeah.
They are real memory for us. And it's the same if you were to go to Ireland. There would be particular historical events that still have ramifications now, and they would talk about particular events historically as if they'd happened last week.
Yes.
Because the implications of them are present and vivid now.
Yeah. I think that's really important. When I say I don't think in linear terms, it's because I think in Jewish terms.
Yeah.
And looking back to significant moments. And when we relive those moments, the same power and presence of God has got the possibility of being there. And I think in that way. But just a joke side, in terms of members of the family, I remember going to Ireland, and the first time I met Mike Cullen.
Michael.
Yeah, and I pulled up outside St Brendan's Cathedral, and Mike's standing and he's waving, Michael's standing and he's waving, and he's saying to us, he's shouting, "John, are you alright?" And I'm saying, "Yes," and then he's shouting, "Brendan, John's here! It's fantastic! Beautiful. Brendan, John's here!" So I walked up to Michael, right? I walked up to Michael and said, "Who are you talking to?" "I'm talking to Brendan, for goodness sake. I need to let him know that you're here." We've been talking about boundaries and hospitality, and especially I'm interested myself. How have you got on here, Andy? You've got Anna, you've got the two kids, and you've got loads of visitors. What sort of boundaries have you had to put in?
I think we had to realise fairly early on that what Anna could cope with hospitality-wise and what I could cope with were different numbers of people. That's just according to our different motivations. You know, my life would always be a crowd scene compared to her preferences. But also, living where we do on Holy Island, we fairly quickly realised that if, for instance, we had a guest room and we did the kind of hospitality that would come naturally to us, we could guarantee that it would be full 365 days each year. And Anna certainly said, "I couldn't live with having people with us all the time like that," and I don't think I could either.
No, the kids.
Oh, certainly not the kids. Whereas if we want to be here long term and do the hospitality seriously, then our rule of saying yes to availability through hospitality has to involve not putting people up, because that way we're able to still be here. We don't get so overwhelmed. And just even the difference of having the shed now, even with this house, makes just an extra space for any one of us to get away to. That's huge. And then we have a friend who gives us the use of a cottage a lot of the time, not to put people up, but if I have a group who come, or somebody turns up and it's raining. Do you know what I mean? There's a place, a physical place other than the home that you can sometimes take people to. And then for a lot of years we had the use of the church as well. You know.
I think the same was true for Linda and I, that we've always been fortunate to have a reasonably sized house, and that God's been in that. But certainly we reached a point at the Grange where we couldn't go on any longer with the hospitality because it was overwhelming, it was expensive, and really we were offering hospitality as a family for what really a community was needing to offer. And when we moved to Hetton, we had the opportunity then to corporately if you like, as a community, care and offer hospitality to people that needed to be. And I think it's important that, we said before, family life is holy ground, and it is important that there's barriers that are put in. Barriers in terms of knowing what your limitations are. There's some lovely desert father stories. I mean, I love the Leek one, where there's a story in the desert. You can imagine different hermitages or little skeets.
This is the water in the vegetables.
Water in the vegetables, they're all over the place. And they had a code in the desert and for people who were difficult, basically. And one of the brothers had some people who came, and basically they were just people who were curious. They were people who weren't serious, and they were taking advantage of the hospitality of the hermit. And I don't know if I get the story exactly, but basically what the hermit said was, when you go down the road and you meet up with the next hermit in the desert, give him a message for me. And the message was simple: don't water the vegetables. And so when the group went off again and they arrived at the hermit's house and he greeted them and he was pleased to see them offering hospitality, they said, oh, we've got a message from the hermit up the road, don't water the vegetables. And that was a clue which said, these people aren't serious, they're just curious. Or even worse than curious, they're just going to use up your time. So the monk said, I'm so pleased to see you. I've got special vigils going on at the moment. We're fasting and we're praying. And one of the things I used to teach people when I first went to Hetton was the whole thing of greeting people and meeting people. And you greet everybody the same. Greeting people with joy, seeing Christ in the person who's being greeted. But you also need to meet with them, and you need to find out why they're there, what it is they need, and are you able to supply their need within the limitations of what God has given to you. And I made some mistakes early on because I used to have people who had psychotic illnesses, and some of the time that was okay, but it got crazy sometimes.
Then you have another thing that happens, and that's that people will come, and if you're not careful, however long they stay, it's just as they're leaving that they begin to open up why they're really there.
Yeah.
But that's just to do with all of us, I think, feeling vulnerable and threatened, and it being hard to let things surface.
And I think it's important as well that you can extend your boundaries. I think what you just said is really important, that you can have somebody staying, and it might be at the most unwelcome times of the day or night, that why they're here emerges. And
it's like people always get baptised. If they're going to get baptised in the North Sea, it always seems to be in February.
Yes, when it's freezing.
Yeah.
I mean, I used to have this thing about doing 3 days and 3 nights, and many times I did 3 days and 3 nights with people, all straight through, where something would happen. The reason why they came to visit us would come out, and you just couldn't stop it. And so we'd have to adjust. Linda'd have to adjust picking up the kid, going to work for me sometimes, because an important moment had happened. And I think this is the difference between hospitality and entertainment. Entertainment is something you're in control of. It's your friends for a particular time, which is great. Hospitality is something God's in control of, and sometimes it'll infringe on your personal space, your personal time. As long as it's God impinging, I think that's impinging. That's it, isn't it? And it's not us just being nice. Because nice can get us in.
I just think for a lot of people, hospitality might mean always keeping a guest room there, so that if somebody comes, you can make the right amount of fuss of them. But if you're in particular circumstances or particular places where people are going to be drawn there, then it might be that in order to offer that level of hospitality, it can't be something that you do on your own.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that recently, actually, because I'm doing something at the moment. And we had a mother house, and we had a mother house with rooms. We had a mother house that had people who are actually able to offer and help other people. People who were trained in retreats, right? People who were able to handle difficult situations because people would have difficult moments, and therefore we handled it together. But when you go down a level, perhaps I've been talking about a prayer house, where specifically you're putting hospitality to one side, you're making your prayer room, your place where people can stay, and you feel as if you've got enough resources to care for those people, and it doesn't just take everything out of you. And then there's the hospitality, where you have no ability to put people up. you know, in that sense. But you've got the opportunity to really meet with people.
And those things can happen that are a God event, as well as things that because folk have been specifically sent to you, or know you already, or connection through the church, or whatever it is. I remember when I was living in the Starbank, just the house opposite, years ago, and there was a lad just turned up at my door, and he'd been at Haggerston and had ended up having some kind of an episode where he had an argument with his family, and he set off and he walked, and by the time he'd walked from Haggerston, his feet were cut and hurt and everything. I ended up, the first thing I did was sit him down, put the kettle on, and literally went down, washed his feet while I tried to find out what was going on with him. We're still in contact with that lad now, you know, after all these years. But so that's a practical thing, and you know as you're doing it, it's kind of like you wash the feet of the stranger, and it's something of biblical proportions, but it's actually happening in a real life situation where you know that person's been sent to you.
I think that's really helpful. One of the things I learned off Andy early on was, one, you didn't need a home for hospitality. You'd create a home where you were. I watched that. And the second thing is, you didn't need to be somebody to experience your hospitality. And that was an important thing to me, because so many times I've seen in the world and the church that the more important you are, the more greeted you are, the more hospitality you got. But to be fair to you, and I've seen it and I learned from it, you had everybody in your entourage for hospitality. Sometimes I think, oh, what's he doing now? But that's true. Yeah. And I think if that was ever lost, I used to see it down North Friary where people, the brothers used to treat the wayfarers. Yeah. And if that's ever lost, then I think something serious is lost. Let's move on then. Intercession. Now you brought from Canada, from one of your...
From YWAM.
From YWAM. Yeah. Joyce Huggett, was it? Not
No, Joy Dawson.
Joy Dawson, that's it, Joy Dawson.
Now, to me, this business of there being three voices, it's all very important. If you look at the story where Jesus is saying, and who do you say that I am? Which is almost back to the, who is it that you seek? And Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Peter's listening to the words as they come out of his mouth, because he never thought before he said anything, or did anything actually. And Jesus says, well, flesh and blood can't have revealed that to you. You know, you're saying more than you know. And then he goes on and starts sharing stuff that's been on his heart. And Peter's saying, oh no, that's not going to happen. No, I don't like that. And straight away Jesus has to block him and says, get behind me, Satan. And he's talking not to Peter, but he's talking to what is coming through Peter's words. So in the same way, there can be all sorts of stuff comes into our head, which can be from God, can be from the enemy, or can be just from our own imaginations or preconceived ideas. And that becomes a minefield when we're trying to hear from God. So the good stuff with the listening prayer, the principles of intercession, is one that you specifically are laying some time aside to say, okay, God, what's on your heart? How can I participate through prayer in your purposes? And then you actually take authority over every voice of the enemy by being a chain of command thing. We're under authority, so in the name of Jesus we take authority over every voice of the enemy. But we also put down our own preconceived ideas and every high thought that would exalt itself against the knowledge of God. 2 Corinthians 10, 4-6, something like that. And that was a new thing to me, the fact that we could take authority over our own stuff. And as we do that, we create a space where we can listen, and we give them perhaps a picture, perhaps a word, a piece of information, a reference, whatever it might be. And as we pool those and then begin to pursue them, so God can take us on a journey in prayer where he begins to share things that might be his preoccupations rather than our own. That's been important.
This has taken us over the years on very important journeys, hasn't it?
Yes.
I mean, you talked one earlier, and we couldn't even go into that. But I mean, it was something that was significant. The significance of it actually in society, but you couldn't even relate that. but it involved a lot of energy, a lot of concentration.
When we've done workshops on intercessory listening prayer,
Yeah.
and I've even done this in contexts where you've got people who are not believers, and the fact that you actually just take authority over that, and they'll have the most amazing, astonishing revelations as part of that workshop. And we've actually had instances where people have come to the Lord through actually recognising that they'd heard from God.
Yeah, to be honest, for me, I've begun to appreciate this teaching more in the last few years,
Yes.
as I've begun to relate it to some of the stuff I've been doing New Age-wise, because there's a definite opportunity for people to participate in the spiritual world, but in a way that they're actually putting some armour on, they're putting something around them that doesn't completely and utterly protect them, because none of us are completely and utterly protected, but gives us the ability,
gives you a confidence to proceed.
confidence to proceed. That's it. I mean, over the years, I know for myself, the intercessory groups, I mean, times that we were on Iona, things that seem completely off the wall at times, and also contradictory, when you put them together, it's almost like they become a garment, that you can see a tapestry, and something begins to form and something begins to change. And then you're able to concentrate your prayer on specific situations that you can then trust God to bring the change, bring the power, bring whatever it is that He's trying to do.
I remember just an example with the dance team. We were off on a particular journey where we'd been given a map of the places we were going and the names of particular folk, just through one of our regular listening prayer times. And one of the details of that was that we were to go to Glastonbury with the team. We were to go to the top of Glastonbury Tor at the summer solstice on the morning, and we were to take bread and break bread with the people who had gathered there to greet the sun. And in the picture we were taking Northumbrian stutty bread. And we got there, and Paul Hendy was shown in prayer just before we got there a particular side of the top of the Tor. When he got there, there were some people who were from a place where he lived, and he was able to immediately relate to them. They were there just for a walk that morning and turned up totally randomly. But then as we got there and we broke the stutty bread, the lad who was there in a green cloak with, I think it was green, with a horn ready to blow the moment when the sun appeared, he was there, and we came towards him with the bread. He saw the stutty bread and broke into tears and fell into my arms, and he was from Morpeth, and the last time he'd been in Northumberland had been for his mum's funeral. And God knew the detail of that, and that it was important to do specifically what we heard.
Yeah, and that's what I've liked about the intercession stuff over the years, is that God's in the details.
Yes.
And what might seem absolutely trivial, absolutely pathetic at times, is something that really has a trigger effect in somebody's life and changes.
When
something.
we've been in situations, say at Glastonbury Festival or some of these sorts of situations, you're having to hear moment by moment, and using those principles have been amazing. I remember me and Anna once having to go on site, and people got pictures that we couldn't make any sense of, and they handed it to us because we were going on site. And the three pictures we got, as we walked on site, they suddenly became like a map, and we were walking through things that we had drawings of, and we didn't even know what they were, and they just confirmed to us that what we were about was the right thing.
Now, we will make available to you, absolutely free, this teaching, which you'll be able to download, so you'll get a better idea of what we're mumbling on about. But it's important to us, and it's been important to an awful lot of people.
And I think sometimes in the community, I've just been saying to folk that we have under-taught the actual detail of how to use that kind of system. That it's sounded like a more general principle about making ourselves available for intercession. But what was implied when we used those words in the rule initially was that people would have an experience of knowing what that was like, so that from time to time at least they would make themselves available.
Yeah, you certainly couldn't do it all the time because it gets too intense.
Yeah. There you go. One of the examples of that would be a picture that we had in listening prayer years ago of the Athona community. And so we asked an artist to take that picture and make it into a physical picture, and we took it with us on the trip down. And it's interesting that the folk from the community started recognising different folk who'd been drawn there, and the couple at the front came that night along the beach and came in where we were doing a dance workshop and stayed the night. And it was just that kind of detail that God knows the folk. And this was a picture about having a fence so that people are able to sit on it as they explore matters of faith.